Now, the levels of a rubric are often the part that are most incorrectly developed. And this affects your final assessment of the learner. So it's important that you get these levels correct. Now, the first thing to look at is that each level should provide a clear guideline on how to evaluate the learner's performance and understanding. This is essential. Rubrics can have as many different levels as required, and we'll look a bit later at how do we determine this number of levels, or the number of levels. Each level should be clearly defined. The levels need to be measurable, otherwise you can't put an accurate assessment to it. And then most importantly, each level should indicate a different level of cognitive ability. It doesn't make sense to have one or two that are similar, because then how do you decide on which one to indicate for the learner? So make sure that each one has a different level of cognitive ability. In other words, that they stand alone. The levels are a measure of cognitive ability and understanding as well as skills. So we need to look at how do we get these levels? And there are many different predefined concepts that one can use to apply to the levels. And the most common examples are these three. First of all, Bloom's taxonomy, which is often used, or it's best used for assessing interpretation and level of thinking. So for example, content subjects, data and interpretation, investigation, or essay questions. The next is Barrett's taxonomy, and this is best used for assessing reading and comprehension. So this is more in the languages that you can use. And then of course there's the Solo taxonomy, which is the evaluation of skills and ability. So this could often be evaluating practical tasks. Some people use a combination of these, and that's fine. The key thing is to have a good understanding of these. Now, after this video clip, there's a downloadable PDF that explains all three of these taxonomies and gives you a better understanding of them. And if you're still not 100% sure, there is a course that you can do on cognitive levels and taxonomies. And it's a really, really good course to do to help you understand these different levels. Now let's have a look. How do we determine these levels in a rubric? So there are 5 key stages. The first is decide on the number of levels. The next, decide on the concept for the levels. So in other words, what do they actually mean? Then this is the most important. Decide on what we call the can and can't do level. And we'll come back to that just now in the next, looking at how do we actually develop this. Then determine all the other levels. So once you've developed the can and can't do level, then determine all the other levels. And then most importantly, check your levels. Check that they do stand independently of each other, and that there's a clear distinguish between the different levels, so you can allocate a mark or an assessment to that. So let's look at step number 1, deciding on the number of levels. Well, first and most importantly, it's the nature and the type of task that develops this, or that guides you on the number of levels. So for example, whether it's research, visual representation, oral presentation, whether you want them to be more creative and designing and creating and synthesizing, and this is going to determine how many levels you want. It's advisable to use an uneven number. The reason for this is if you have an even number, you can't clearly identify your can and can't do level, and we'll get to that just now. More is often better than not as many. So when you come to 3 levels, there's very little description and individuality of them. Whereas if you've got more levels, it's easier. Now, I generally tend to choose 5 levels. I often think that's probably the easiest. But what we must remember is when it comes to levels, there is no correlation with the levels of a rubric and codes. And there's also no correlation with marks. So for example, if you're allocating codes on a 7-point scale, it doesn't mean to say you've got to have 7 levels. And this is where a lot of people go wrong. Think of the levels independently to the codes and the marks. That'll come later. So step 2. We've now got to decide on the concept of levels. So remember we said there are 3 possible ones, and there are many others, but these are the 3 that are most commonly chosen. There's Bloom's taxonomy, there's Barrett's taxonomy, and then there's the Solo taxonomy. So when you're first developing rubrics, it's advisable just to choose one of these. Don't try and combine them, but you'll find as you get more experienced, you will want to combine them. Right, step 3, and this is where we said you've got to decide on the can and can't do level. Now, what does this mean? Well, you'll notice, first of all, it's in the middle. often the mistake people make is they make the can and can't do level. In other words, can the learner actually do the task? Have they achieved the skill? They put it at level 5. Now, just because a learner has achieved something doesn't mean to say that they're on level 5. It means that they have achieved something. How well they achieve it will depend on where they sit on the levels. So what guidance can we use for the can and can't level? Well, the first is has the learner achieved the skill or not? Are they able to do it? The next is, this is what the curriculum is based on. So if they say a learner needs to be able to count to 10, counting to 10 means that they can do it or they can't do it. That is level 3. How well they count, how their understanding is of it, how quickly they can do it, how often they can repeat it, that will be level 4 or 5. So if we've said the learner's got an understanding of Nelson Mandela, that will be level 3. How well they understand it could determine level 4 or level 5. This is the passing level. Now, a passing level is not sitting on level 5. It's not full marks. It's sitting on level 3. And then it's important that level 3, or the can and can't do level, so whether it's 3 or whatever's in the middle, is a clearly defined level. So it's very clear for you to use that as your benchmark. And then, of course, as we said earlier, it's much better to use an odd number of levels because the middle level means that that's the can and can't do levels. Once we've done that, then you can move on to step 4, which is determining all the other levels. Now, we said here that the can and can't do level sits in the middle. Now, some of you might be familiar with what we call the bell curve. Now, I'm going to explain to you how the bell curve works, and then it should make more sense about where the level 1, 2, 3, and 4 come from, and 5. So let's have a look at the bell curve. Now, in this particular case, this bell curve says that we are measuring down the left-hand side, it says the number of learners. So there we're looking at the number of learners. On the bottom, we are looking at what their achievement is. Now, if you have a look at this particular case, the majority of the learners are sitting between 40 and 50%. I know the graph isn't so accurate, but the idea is to get the shape of the curve. So you want to make your can and can't do level in the middle, and that's where the majority of the learners sit, between 40 and 50%. What this also means is those are your average performers. Now, of course, you've got your lower performers where there are less lower performers. And then you've got your high performers where there are many more performers. So if you look at a class and the spread, you should always have the majority of your learners sitting in the middle. Now, this 40 and 50% is just a guideline. It's an example. You might say, well, it's between 50 and 60%. You might say it's between 40 and 80%. That's up to you. The idea here is that there is a bell curve where the majority of the learners achieve the average marks, and then you've got some learners that achieve higher and some that achieve lower. So coming back to the actual grid, there you can see the majority of learners should be sitting on level 3, the can and can't do. And then you're going to have fewer learners achieving at level 4 and 5 and fewer at 2 and 1. So once we've done the can and can't do level, we then have to determine the other levels. So we start on level 3 in this case, and then we say, right, if level 3 is where we are assessing if they can do the task, or whether they've achieved the skill, then we work down to level 2 and 1, and we work up to level 4 and 5. So this gives us an idea that we have distributed the learners evenly, or not the learners, but we've distributed the ability of the learners, what we expect of them, evenly across those 4 levels. And of course, like we said, step 5, it is essential that we check that there's a progression of skills and cognition of each of the levels, so that level 1 is clearly defined and is different to level 2, 3, 4, and 5. And if you don't get this right in the beginning, it is very difficult to assess a rubric or using a rubric. So make sure this is clear. Like I said right in the beginning, this is where a lot of people go wrong. So let's have a look at how do we apply taxonomy. So I'm going to use the example of Bloom's taxonomy here, and you'll see the levels across the top. There are 5 levels. At the bottom, or level 1, is your knowledge level. This is where the learners just recall information. They can list, they can name. So in other words, that's the lowest level at which they're functioning. The next level is an understanding or a comprehension level. So you want them to demonstrate that they can understand. They need to be able to discuss. They need to be able to summarize. Level 3, and remember here we said this is the can and can't do level. This is where we want the learners to be able to apply the knowledge using what they've learned, using problem-solving methods, designing and experimenting. So this is what we require of the learners in this particular task. This is the can and can't do level. So this is where they're going to get on the level 3. Anything below, it's good that they have the knowledge, it's good that they have the understanding, but it's not enough. Application is the level at which we want them to function at. Then going above application, you've got analysis, or to be able to analyze, where you want them to be able to combine, to compose, to be able to predict outcomes, create new ideas from old concepts. That shows a much greater understanding and ability to apply knowledge. And then, of course, your highest level is your evaluation and creation. And this is where you want the learners to assess patterns or trends, make judgment statements, draw conclusions, make recommendations, and compare ideas using problem-solving techniques. So that is the highest level. So hopefully this makes it a little bit clearer. And as I said, you don't have to use Bloom's. Bloom's is one of the taxonomies you can use. But it's essential that you use a taxonomy to determine these different levels, because it will make your assessment a lot easier. So if we have a look at a summary of the different levels, well, the first is to remember that the levels indicate the learner's skills and cognitive abilities. So they do need to progress. And therefore they indicate the learner's progression, how much they know from one level to the next. They indicate a clear can and can't do level in terms of skills, so that you are able to straight away identify, can they do something or can't they do something? And if they can do it, how well they can do it would be level 4 and 5. And if they can't do it, how little can they do? And that would be level 1 and 2. And then, of course, the most important is the highest level should challenge learners by providing an indication of what is possible. So as soon as you've got a rubric and you start marking all the learners on the highest level, there is a problem with your rubric because you're not challenging the learners. The majority of your learners should fall on the can and can't do level.